Hi, my name is Corie Weathers. I'm a licensed professional counselor and a coach that works with military and first responder couples and their families. I am so excited to spend some time with you this year for Military Marriage Day. Today, we're going to talk about igniting excitement in your relationship. Now, as a counselor and as a coach, by the time couples come to me, they're usually bringing problems or concerns or frustrations about their relationship. And when we talk about igniting excitement or when we talk about intimacy, the first thing that pops up for most people is there must be some tweaks or things that we need to do in the physical area of our life, the physical intimacy. And that is a very, very important part of your relationship. But today, I don't want igniting excitement to be only about bringing passion back into your physical intimacy, because I know that we're going to be addressing that this week as well. Today, I want to spend some time talking with you about how there's actually several different kinds of intimacy. There's lots of different ways that we can connect in our relationship and in our marriage. And it's not just physical intimacy. In fact, there's a lot of couples that struggle with that area of their life due to medical concerns, or you might be in a season of life where you are definitely tired and exhausted because of all the responsibilities that are on your plate. And so we need to think in our relationship outside of just physical intimacy as a way that we connect in our relationship. Did you know that there's actually more than 40 different kinds of intimacy in relationships, in marriage specifically? Now, when I first heard that, I was blown away. Like, I was lucky to be able to come up with like 3, but apparently there's 40, and there is more counting. There's more research that's going on all the many ways that we can be vulnerable and connect with our spouse. There is intellectual intimacy. If you are a couple that loves to really, I know my husband and I love this. We can sit down over a cup of coffee for a good 3 or 4 hours when we have that time to talk about all kinds of deep topics. That's an intellectual intimacy. There's recreational intimacy. That's one of my favorites, where I love to go for walks or hike or camp or kayak. And that doing that with my husband is a way that I feel connected, and it's a playful form of intimacy. There's emotional intimacy, and that's where a lot of people lean towards emotional intimacy when they think of connecting with their spouse. So I'm not going to be able to take the time to go through all 40 of these different intimacy types, but I did want to kind of open your mind to the many types of ways that we can connect with our spouse, regardless of where you are and what season of your life, whether you have kids or whether you've got crazy work schedules or lots of stress on your plate. There are lots of different ways, and we're going to talk about the importance of finding those ways to connect with your spouse. Which, by the way, it's so normal for marriages to ebb and flow with finding time together, for sure. But there is this ebb and flow of energy, of passion, of moments where we feel super connected with our spouse and moments where life gets really stressful. There's a lot on our plate and we feel distracted. And so we kind of get into that friendship portion of our relationship and our shoulder to shoulder doing life together, trusting each other that relationship is strong and healthy, and that while we're going through this difficult time of heavy distraction and maybe lots on our plate, that maybe the passion and the connection isn't there, but it's maybe just temporary until we can kind of come out of that season and enter a new season of actual connection. So I want to kind of normalize, first of all, that it's okay for your relationship to ebb and flow, or if you want to think of it like kind of like a chart where you kind of go up and down, like good times and bad times. Times of high connectivity and times of less connectivity. And that maybe we kind of start with this groundwork of that there's a foundation and a framework of friendship that keeps us connected regardless of what's going on, regardless of the ebb and flow and all of that. So just know that it's normal to have periods of time where you're super connected and periods of time where you feel less connected because of what's on your plate. One of my favorite things to say to couples all the time is seasons are seasons because they change, right? Fall changes to winter. Winter changes to spring. Spring, unfortunately here in Texas, changes to summer, right? So it's okay for your relationship to go through these seasons. However, if the season is never changing, that's usually a red flag that it's not a season and that there's something for us to take a look at. So, if nothing else, I wanted to encourage you that it is normal for you to have those ups and downs in your relationship of feeling connected. But there should be seasons. You should be open to having the support when you need it. And that it's okay to try new things, okay? And by the end of our talk today, I'm definitely going to give you a tool that's for free that you can walk away with. It's my 5-minute check-in. I'll tell you more about that. But it's a free tool that literally in 5 minutes or less will leave you feeling very connected with your spouse, okay? So I sat down and thought through like what's going on in the military lifestyle that actually makes us feel disconnected or robs us of connection, and what kind of threatens our relationship, right? So I've kind of already talked about some of the normal things that might threaten a marriage relationship, but there's also some unique factors about military marriage that I think we have to be kind of aware of or on guard of if we're going to protect our relationship and not find ourselves disconnected because of this lifestyle. This is where we become proactive, that we think about it ahead of time to go, all right, this is what this lifestyle can send our way. How can we be proactive and prepared so that we don't accidentally or gradually over time find ourselves in a heavy state of disconnection, okay? So number one, the military lifestyle creates over time kind of this feeling of having two very separate worlds. Now, if you are a dual service couple, perhaps there's a lot of you get the same language, you have the same kind of similar job as a service member, and so you share that language, you share that lifestyle, and you also share what it means to be a spouse at home. I still think, though, that even in a marriage like that, you still are living these two different kinds of roles. You have a different MOS, you have a different talent, you have a different work system with different leaders, different people that you're working around. So you have still these two different worlds. But for the what I'll call more traditional couple, where you have a supporting spouse at home and you have a service member, whether you're retired or reserves or guard or whatever, there is this service member kind of world that understands and goes through deployments and trainings and what it means to be in a group of people that share a heavy common mission together. What it means to sacrifice your family in order to put the mission first. That is one world, right? But for the supporting spouse at home, there's a whole other world of what it means to dig deep, what it means to hold down the home front, what it means to leverage grit on the hardest days when perhaps your spouse is deployed and you still have to find the energy to push through. That's a whole other world. Also leaning on your community for support on days that you just need a friend and you just need someone to talk to, right? I'm a military spouse, by the way, and so I understand what that is like. I understand what it's like to have a marriage where it sometimes feels like you're on two parallel tracks that rarely intersect. And when it comes to working on your relationship, the question is, how do we get these two different worlds to intersect more often? How do we get these tracks to cross? How do we find new understanding? And so I often tell couples, when you're starting to feel that way, it doesn't really work to try to force the other person to understand your world, because they're not living in that world, right? They're two very separate worlds doing two very separate things. We want to talk about it. We want to create understanding. But the solution can't always be forcing the other person to understand it, because they're never going to fully understand it. I, as a spouse, am never going to fully understand what it means to actually to be deployed for a long period of time, much less to a place of danger or a place where I've gone long periods of time without being connected to my family. I just will never fully understand what that's like. I can imagine it, but living it is something different. And the same is true for our service members trying to understand what it's like to be that supporting spouse at home. So number one, I think this lifestyle can create over time what feels like very separate lives. And if we're not careful, we'll find ourselves digging a groove into those separate tracks, and eventually just saying, you know what, I don't get you, you don't get me, and let's just live in agreement of that. that's not okay, right? You didn't sign up for marriage for a marriage like that, right? So it's definitely something that can rob our marriage of that connection. Number two is just life stuff, right? Kids, responsibility. If you have young children, it takes a lot of physical energy for both of you. In fact, one of the couples that I was working with recently, they were potty training their second child. And it occurred to the supporting spouse at home, the wife, that her husband was actually deployed when she was potty training the first child, right? And so now the service member was coming in trying to help with potty training the second child, but they had never done it before. And yet it's the spouse's second time, right? So sometimes we're like in the thick of life and we're raising children, or perhaps you're older and you're taking care of family members that are aging, or perhaps you have a very stressful job. Both of you maybe have stressful jobs, right? So sometimes there's seasons of life that are very difficult, and what you have on your plate is robbing you of time to connect. Perhaps you haven't had a date night for a very, very long time, right? Because there's just too much to do and too many, and I've heard from so many people just trying to find childcare is very challenging. And so we end up sacrificing time to connect and being strategic to make those date nights or time to connect priority. And so if you're far from family and far from what feels like support to make that possible, we can sacrifice that over time and find ourselves disconnected. So there's definitely seasons of life, but here on this one, I want you to think about what are the things that distract you from connecting with your spouse. I could do a whole other talk on social media and our devices and video games, right? Number three, I hear this from a lot of couples, and it may not apply to everyone, but it's one that's, I think, very important, and that is the topic of clearance. There are a lot of couples out there, especially military couples, who have clearance. Their service spouse has a top secret clearance, or maybe something higher, a different kind of clearance that keeps them from being able to talk with their spouse and their family members about what they do, when they do it, where they're going, and sometimes how do I describe how much I love my job if I can't talk with them about what I do? And that can cause a lot of disconnect in a relationship. One of the saddest things for me is when I find a couple that genuinely feels like there's nothing for them to talk about because of clearance issues. And so they stop talking altogether. And of course, the biggest thing I say to them all the time is you actually have plenty to talk about. We can talk about loving our job. We can talk about loving what we get to do. We can talk about the frustration of the workday. We can talk about the frustration of leadership if that's the issue, without going into clearance issues. But for a lot of couples, that can be a major issue. If that's not you, we can apply that in other ways, in that going back to that lack of understanding of what we do. Perhaps you're in two different jobs or have two different callings or two different interests, hobbies and passions that you try to connect, but you just don't share that same passion. So what do we have to talk about, right? So there's so many more things that can distract us from our relationship or leave us disconnected. But those are the top three that I hear most often. But that's not why you're here today listening to me right now. What you really want to hear about is how do we reignite excitement in our relationship. And so I wanted to give you a couple of things to think about, and some skills or maybe some things that you can practice in your relationship. How do you make a difference and push the needle, move the needle on your relationship and the feeling connection that you have today? So first of all, yes, I'm going to say go have a date night, right? But for many of you, practically and logistically, that's really challenging and difficult. And so we all learned during COVID how to be creative with date night, even if you have to stay at home. So I don't want to stop there and just give you the idea or encourage you only to do date nights. I actually want to take a different angle with this. I think that we need to bring in more shared opportunities, shared interests, introduce some new shared interests into your relationship to spark new excitement, okay? So, Gottman is a very famous marriage expert who's done tons of research. In fact, he can actually predict whether a couple is likely to divorce within 5 minutes of watching them have a conversation, right? And Here's a spoiler alert. It has a lot to do with eye contact. It has a lot to do with how we receive and hear each other, how we respond to our spouse when they're talking. But he said something that I thought was super interesting. He said it's less about what you go do together and more about how you treat each other while you're doing it. Okay, so when we talk about doing something exciting, when we go back to those 40 different kinds of intimacy, and so it's less about what we choose to do together and more about how we treat each other when we are doing whatever it is that we're introducing into our relationship. So I find that a lot of couples hit a stalemate when we kind of collect some hobbies, and military couples are notorious for creating individual hobbies that we're not sharing together, right? Especially when you're spending so much time apart. Like if you're a supporting spouse at home, at some point, even if you have young children, you probably say to yourself, I have got to find some level of purpose or identity or something that interests me other than just housework or raising kids or maybe even your job, right? And so we tend to, and even service members while they're deployed will pick up hobbies or interests to entertain themselves when things are really boring or there's not a whole lot going on and they're just kind of sitting around, right? So I think we can kind of, again, deepen those grooves into this is what I do and this is what you do. And so I really want to challenge you to think about and talk with your spouse. How do we introduce some new hobbies, some new interests that we can do together? Now, the first question that comes up is what if what I like to do is not what my spouse wants to do? For example, if you already have hobbies or interests that you're not really sharing together, maybe you've had lots of conversations about that already. In fact, a lot of couples tell me one person loves video games and the other person hates them, right? And it becomes a conflict. Perhaps the answer to that is not about fighting about that anymore, although whole other conversation if it's about talking together about boundaries, about how much time we spend doing those things and making sure we have connection for each other. I'm talking about maybe if it's a hot topic or maybe if it's something you've already agreed and decided that it's not something that you really share together, maybe we bring in some new ideas and some new things that we can try together. For example, what is an activity that you've always wanted to do? Maybe it's on your bucket list that you've always wanted to do and you've never tried it before, right? Dr. Les Parrott, in fact, his wife is named Leslie. They've written so many books. They're good friends of mine. They're Les and Leslie Parrott is their names. But he told me one time that for an exciting date night, they went and did trapeze. Like they literally went to learn how to do swing on a trapeze because they'd never done it before and it sounded crazy, right? It got them out of their box, out of their mundane kind of dinner and date kind or dinner and a movie kind of date, right? So sometimes it's just doing an activity that maybe seems out of the box kind of idea, exciting, maybe something on your bucket list that neither of you have ever thought of doing before, right? Shake things up a little bit. Laugh together. Do something that is out of your comfort zone. Definitely doing trapeze is one of those, or would be for me, right? My husband and I always talk about what it'd be like to go out and try golfing. We don't golf. We've never golfed before. We'd be terrible at it. So we would definitely have to pick a day when nobody else is on the golf course because we would be a hot mess, right? But the reason why we've talked about doing it is because I can just see ourselves laughing through the whole thing. Like we would be terrible, right? And so the point is not picking up a hobby that you're amazing at, because believe it or not, if you kind of have, well, it depends. Some couples are super competitive, right? But like sometimes if you try and go and do something with your spouse and your spouse is amazing at it and you're not, you might feel that feeling of insecurity. So sometimes it's great to pick up something that neither of you know how to do. It's out of your comfort zone because it invites playfulness. It invites a memory of playfulness and laughter and excitement, right? Now, if you do decide to go do something that maybe your spouse is good at and you're not, it is another way to generate excitement. So sometimes it is good to lean into those things that your spouse is really excited about. We're hoping maybe you make an arrangement or a deal that we kind of lean into each other, that you try what he wants to do and he tries what you want to do. and you kind of step into each other's world a little bit more often, right? So perhaps you sit down and actually do that shared activity of a video game together, even though you feel terrible at it. I've been on several retreats where spouses, supporting spouses, go and learn how to do shotgunning and archery, something that their spouse has qualified on a range to do, picking up weapons and having to qualify in them as their world, right? But there was something about stepping into the insecurity of, yes, I may not be good at it, but for my own sake, I'm going to step in and try this activity and not feel ashamed or afraid or embarrassed, and just do it and allow my spouse to teach me and allow my spouse to express their excitement in it, and for me to appreciate that excitement in them and let them maybe give me some pointers. That's a very vulnerable thing to do. I mean, that's why it's a great idea to share that and kind of go the other direction and make that arrangement for you guys to, like, now we come back and do this thing that I love to do, right? But I've seen so many spouses, supporting spouses, go and do that shotgunning or archery or pick up that weapon, right? Find a little bit of confidence in it. And then they came back home from that retreat, and the only thing that they wanted for Christmas was an archery set, or the only thing that they wanted was a membership to the shooting range, right? So now that they could do it with their spouse, it ignites some new excitement in their relationship to kind of step out of their comfort zone and share something that their spouse is also interested in. So there's lots of different ways that you can spark new excitement in your relationship. If you got nothing else out of this other than trying some new things and maybe thinking outside of your average date night, I hope you picked up on the themes of what it means to make yourself vulnerable to your spouse. A lot about generating excitement in your relationship and crossing these parallel paths that have been very comfortable in their groove for a long time takes vulnerability. In fact, some of my favorite colleagues and experts in the marriage world, when they describe intimacy, they use the phrase "into me see." That intimacy is not, again, always about sexual intimacy, that it can be about, do you see into my soul? Do you see into who I am? Do I allow you to see who I am? Even if that's flaws or imperfection, or that I'm not really good at something. And so when we try these shared activities that are new and out of that comfort zone, we are making ourselves vulnerable and saying, I'm not good at this, and maybe you're not good at it either, but maybe we can find ourselves comfortable with what we are uncomfortable with, and be intimate that way and vulnerable, and be playful with it and enjoy that time together, enjoy being not good at something, right? So I said that I would close with giving you a tool that can make you feel really connected very quickly. I have a whole video that I can share a link with you on how you can dive a little bit deeper with this 5-minute check-in. But I will tell you very quickly, it came after years of using marriage communication tools to help couples connect through their communication. But I found that some tools were super complex and almost launched couples into conflict trying them, and that some tools were maybe too easy, that didn't leave them feeling super connected, right? And so I created what's called the 5-minute check-in, pulling a lot of these tools together, my favorite parts of these tools together into one tool. And it literally takes 5 minutes or less. And it's really only 4 questions. And you can decide whether you take turns answering one question at a time, or whether you go through all 4 and then your spouse goes through all 4. But they're very simple questions. It's number 1, physically what's going on in my body, or what's just kind of my 5 senses, right? We collect information through our 5 senses. What we're seeing, what we're hearing, or what we saw that day, or what we heard from our boss that day, says a lot about how we're doing, how we slept that night. If you have a newborn, you didn't sleep well. And so being able to communicate that I'm tired is very important in a relationship, so that when you come down the stairs and you're super grumpy because you didn't sleep well, by telling your spouse, this is what's going on in my body, I didn't sleep well last night, it communicates to them it's not them, it's the fact that you didn't sleep well, that you're not angry with them, right? So it's very important to be able to communicate these 4 things, right? But what's going on in my body? What's the 5 senses? Physically, what am I feeling? Number 2, what have my thoughts been lately? What's my thoughts been about the day? What has my thoughts been about the week? Or if you're like me, I have these big thoughts that kind of for a whole season, here's just been what's on my mind lately. Number 3 is, what are my emotions about that? Like, what do I think about it, but also what do I feel about that? Believe it or not, you probably know this is not new information. Usually in a couple, you have one that's able to communicate their feelings really well and someone else that really struggles to communicate their emotions. And so using a tool like the Feelings Wheel, you can find it at feelingswheel.com, to help you with words behind those feelings can be super helpful. Instead of just saying I'm sad, it's different to say my friend said something today that made me feel betrayed. That's a whole other word from sad, right? So expressing what's going on in our body, what have my thoughts been lately, what are my feelings about that? And the last one is very important, and that's, what do I need? And sometimes expressing what you need is about, what do I personally need that only I can do for myself? Sometimes it's, what do I need that only you can do for me? And it's knowing the difference between those two, right? So communicating to our spouse, what I need is 30 minutes by myself where I can have a thought and maybe journal for a moment and have a complete thought, right? Or saying, what I really need is to do a better job of carving time to take care of myself, physically or emotionally or mentally, right? Those are two very different kinds of needs that we need to be able to express to our spouse in order for them to help us win, right? Your spouse wants to get this right. You want to get this right. Nobody wants a marriage that feels disconnected. Everybody's trying to do the best that they can to win the day and have a successful relationship. We have to believe that. Shanti Feldhahn is one of my favorite researchers on relationships, and she found that of the happiest couples, 99% of them, of the happiest couples that she could find, it came down to one thing, that they believed their spouse had their best interests at heart, that they weren't trying to hurt them. So a happy, centered, connected couple honestly believes that their spouse is doing the best that they can and doesn't want to hurt them, right? And I believe that's true about your relationship as well. It's a great place to start. So, how do you reignite excitement in your relationship? It really comes down to, how do we intersect these parallel paths more often? If the military lifestyle is going to make us feel very separate and different from each other, it's up to you. It's up to me to create more opportunities to intersect with our spouse when we can. We can do that through hobbies, shared interests, trying new things. Sure, we can do that on date nights as well. But here's a little secret. You can also do that by opening your ears and actually listening to your spouse when they're talking to you. Just that one thing alone reignites connection, okay? We sometimes make it so much harder than it needs to be. I've even taken couples and said, stare into each other's eyes for 30 seconds. Don't say a word, but sit knee to knee for 30 seconds and just stare into each other's eyes. And the first thing they do is giggle, because we have all these walls up. We don't want to feel seen. We don't want that intimacy. We don't want them to see into our soul. And our soul is seen through our eyes, right? But then if I ask them to go 30 seconds longer, by that 45-second mark, tears start to flow because they feel seen without a word being spoken. Sometimes we make it so much harder than it needs to be. You can reconnect with your spouse. You don't have to force your spouse to understand your world. It doesn't have to be the answer. Sometimes it's allowing ourselves to be seen and choosing to see our spouse and making ourselves vulnerable. I am encouraging you, though, to make some intentional effort to maybe do it in a playful way and maybe try some new things that really generate some new excitement, and maybe explore some of these 40 different ways to invite intimacy into your relationship. Thank you so much for giving me the time and the attention to invest and pour into you and into your marriage. Your marriage is worth it. Your family is worth it. If you have kids, your kids are worth every bit of work that you put into your relationship. Take care of you, take care of your spouse, and take care of your marriage. Happy Military Marriage Day.